and we will get our lovely bot in here. I think probably this is the best call. And we'll get moving. I think this should be theory. All right, look, live and all. Okay. People there won't yell at me, and now people in Discord hopefully won't yell at me too. All right. Oh God, it's gonna be 3.9. Let's get our bot in here and
now recording.
Excellent. Hello everyone. I hope all of you are doing at least fairly well. That probably peaked a little bit too fucking high, as happens. I hope all of you are doing well. We have completed 3.8 and our recap, and we're now moving into 3.9. Finally. And this is like the meat and potato stuff. This is what you do the rest of AO4 for a lot of people, is you make your way to capitalism. And how do we look at the world? How do we understand the things happening around us? And how do we understand how we are produced in this space? Lo and behold, we are there. So it's been about time, I think most of you would agree. I don't think I have terribly huge amounts of shit in order to go over today. Mostly, I think we're just going to dive right in. Oh, God. I feel like we just want to just go. If you've missed, we've talked about the state formation. The state formation, the Urstadt, the original state, the only one state, the blah, 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 all these things. The idealized state is going to be where capitalism really begins. It's where deterritorialization happens. We're going to have a lot of new words, a lot of new ways to describe things. It's going to be its own gigantic, huge thing. So as we go, as always, don't hesitate to drop a note in chat, to raise your hand. Try not to interrupt me unless you absolutely need to, but we will make our way through and we will see where we get to today in Anti-Oedipus 3.9, the civilized capitalist machine. Let me share my screen and we'll get going. The first great movement of deterritorialization appears with the overcoding performed by the despotic state. But it is nothing compared to the other great movement, the one that will be brought about by the decoding of flux. I will, by the way, not use the term flows where it's not needed or not used. The action of decoded flux is not enough, however, to cause the new break to traverse and transform the socius. Not enough, that is, to endorse the birth of capitalism. Decoded flux strike the despotic state with latency. They submerge the tyrant, but they also cause him to return in unexpected forms. They democratize him, oligarchize him, segmentalize him, monarchize him, and always internalize and spiritualize him. While on the horizon, there is the latent Urstadt, for the loss of which there is no consolation. It is now up to the state to recode as best it can by means of regular and exceptional operations, the product of the decoded flux. Let us take the example of Rome. The decoding of the landed flux, de flux français, through the privatization of property, the decoding of monetary flux through the formation of great fortunes, the decoding of the commercial flux through the development of commodity production, the decoding of the producers through expropriation and proletarianization. All the preconditions are present. Everything is given without producing a capitalism properly speaking, but rather a regime based on slavery. Or the example of feudalism. There again, private property, commodity production, the monetary afflux, the extension of the market, the development of towns, and the appearance of manorial ground rent in money form, or the contractual hiring of labor do not by any means produce a capitalist economy, but rather a reinforcing of feudal offices and relations, at times a return to more primitive stages of feudalism, and occasionally even the reestablishment of a kind of slavery. It is well known the monopolistic action favoring the guilds and the companies promotes not the rise of capitalist production, but the insertion of the bourgeois into a town and state feudalism that consists in devising codes for flux that are decoded as such, and in keeping the merchants, according to Marx's formula, in the very pores of the full body of the social machine. Hence, capitalism does not lead to the dissolution of feudalism, but rather the contrary. And that is why so much time was required between the two. There's a great difference in this respect between the despotic age and the capitalist age. For the founders of the state come like lightning. The despotic machine is synchronic, while the capitalist machine's time is diachronic. The capitalists appear in succession in a series that institutes a kind of creativity of history, a strange menagerie, the schizoid time of the new creative break. For those who may have joined us this last reading, we learned that feudalism, as sort of we have understood or has been taught, doesn't actually exist. I think it actually still applies. It's an odd term here to use in its case, but he is speaking of a specific time frame. So we'll break down this paragraph, and it kind of gels actually with what I was able to read from a handful of sources that we were given about feudalism and all that. But again, at a core level, we should not be thinking of, okay, well, the despotic age ended, capitalism began. Capitalism came in when we needed to or did decode flows, or when we did this or that, these little pieces. Their underlying point that they're making here is that they're really the action of the despotic state, the way that it operates, is similar to how capitalism needed to operate to begin, but it's not where it began. As they say, the action of the decoded flux is not enough to cause the new break to traverse and transform the socius. Parts of how capitalism function appearing is not really the change in the socius. It's not the change in capitalism. This is to just go with, I think, the easiest example from Marx. A lot of people confuse capital with commodity currency or money. People think, oh, well, look, there were merchants buying and selling things. That's a market. That's a marketplace. Marketplace means capitalism. Not really the case, though. Not only in Marx's own writings is it absolutely not the case, because commodity currency and capitalist currency, or industrial currency as he called it, are wholly, wholly different in how they operate. But it's actually in the way that Deleuze and Guattari are doing their best to sort of bring it to discuss it. It's not about, at that point, rearranging the socius at all. Instead, these things may be present, everything is given, without producing capitalism, but rather a regime, a despotic regime based on slavery. I've always liked this line because there's this great book called "The Half Has Never Been Told," the story of slavery and American capitalism. It's brutal to read, but it is very clear sort of how the slavery aspect of this works, how it had worked, how these things, these parts of the old despotic machine were able to maintain their power, and how they sort of utilized these tools of what we would come to call financial capitalism or come to call capitalism, yet still would use it in service of and building the despotic state, the feudal offices and relations, as he calls them here, which I think is probably a decent shorthand for that type of discussion. Really interesting sort of way to think about it. Jack, you got any thoughts? Anything to add before we start going beat by beat?
Um, I guess, like I said last week, I'd be really careful about the way they use terms that seem intuitively familiar.
Yeah.
Like for slavery, when they've talked about that, they're talking about how overcoding uses linguistics as a form of enslavement um, for the semiotics of the syntheses, right? Like, and it's getting connected with the way that caste is getting negated, if you will, into class, right? Like there's a lot behind this in terms of how they think about things. despite the words seeming, you know, it
Or even the
seeming
structure
obvious at
seeming
first glance.
similar, because caste and class, the afterimage of both can seem very similar. And that's one of the things that they got into a little bit earlier, is the distinction between sort of how the caste is enforced through the despotic or the state versus what will come to be how classes will come to exist. And I think, I mean, they say it in that sort of awkward, almost the proletarization. God, it's not even a fucking word. The decoding of the producers, the labor force, through expropriating their labor and the proletarization of their caste. These are the preconditions that are present. So they're even making the comment outright. These things exist. These parts are happening, but they're not yet capital, because this is not really what makes the capitalist socialist. This isn't the thing. We're not quite there yet. I hope that's kind of what you're saying, Beck.
Well, it's a contrast, right? So it's, you know, it's a juxtaposition, right? There's caste under the despotic, there's class under um, capital, right? And the way those two things function synthetically, right?
Mhm.
Because, like, I mean, the main thing that's going to take place, right, is the second great deterritorialization. So what you're getting is how the second synthesis begins doing the thing the first two wouldn't allow, which is working with decodification, which is why the slavery thing is worth keeping in mind in terms of overcoding, right? Is what does it mean to discuss a kind of enslavement that has hitherto been linguistic and overcoded? Now, with the introduction of decoding, that was otherwise excluded from that kind of slavery.
Just a question. I kind of get the sense that they're saying that there's not that much difference in terms of slavery, subordination of of people to a kind of hierarchy of power between the despotic and the capitalist. So I was just wondering what is the difference if they talk about the deteriorization, decoding, and recoding and so forth in a capitalist structure. Does that mean that the decoding means that there is a kind of transformation of the despotic state, which has a more is more hierarchical, uh, more more despotic or more authoritarian,
Yeah,
as opposed to a capitalist system of being you know slavery and so forth by means of you know labor surplus or yeah.
see that's kind of what I'm driving at in those remarks I'm making. Like, keep in mind, right, that the despotic is a socius, right? Going straight at it in terms of the authoritarian leader, I think can get really messy quick, especially because the state itself includes the serfs, includes the aristocrats, includes, you know, the despot, right, in a general sense. But like they're saying here, right, there's a way in which the despotic can work democratically and through other kinds of, we'll say, forms of social governance by which the state still maintains that kind of, um, you know, those kind of three groups, if you will, right? I don't know if I want to call it a structure just yet, but it looks like one. Those three groups, while still speaking to something other than, I think, simple authoritarianism, right? Because those three groups function through overcoding, right? And that's the real trick of the state, right? That's what the Erstat's giving you is as the state shifts, say is in terms of social governance, if you like, what's consistent is the use of overcoding, which for the despotic socius will prevent decoded flows, right? Whereas for capital, that's going to be a bit of a different story.
Yeah, it's important when we're talking about this. The specific lens and the direction they're coming at this is trying to have us sort of get a universal history and an understanding of the production of the social, and do so in a way that's genealogical to sort of what came before it, rather than thinking of these sort of idealized structures. Oh, the state existed. Here's the 19 forms of the state. Excellent. Capitalism is these 12 things that existent or are existent. Instead, the question that they're asking, and it's the thing sort of from the beginning has been, how are we produced? How is our repression produced? How is social production and desiring machines, how do all of these things sort of come together? And so when we talk about social production as a thing, it's not really about purely economics and power. That's not their primary mode of analysis. Instead, their primary mode of analysis is sort of to talk through how elements sort of combine, how production is claimed, how anti-production comes in. And it's a lot of these things, the way Holland lays it out and sort of talks about these things is we want to sort of talk through first the socius as a focal point or support for a social investment of desire. There's a specific mode or operation of anti-production. Then there's surplus value, debt, specific forms of coding, and specific forms of inscription. You end up in these kinds of places that they want to be talking about. So like a generalized social production with the sort of earth socius. We have the earth as the socius for the savage times, as they use the terms. The reason they do that is because the earth is what gets to claim those things. It's what gets to claim and sort of impart itself into all of this. So the socius, the focal point, the support of the social investment for desire is the earth, the land, this place around them. It's an animist almost view of things. Then they have the barbarous despot. And so it's this focal point of support for the social investment of desire is now in this position. But the move to capitalism specifically is not just purely, oh, we don't have despots anymore. Well, you might, things change. You might have a monarch, or you might end up having a president. It might be liberal democracy. You might have a parliament and have no singular leader, whatever it may be. That's not really the point, because the structure of power itself or the structure of economics isn't the big deal. The big deal is how all of these things sort of produce the subjectivity within them. And capitalism, very particularly, as they've sort of laid out in this chapter, is not just about a handful of these like sort of simple facts on the grounds that are ultimately latent or after images of things, but instead it's this weird play of decoding and recoding, this odd shift that happens as we move from just, some decoding happens in overcoding with the despot, which is for that setup. Now we're moving into something different. Now it's a different play into this decoding and recoding.
So just a question, is there more repression under a despot, or is there more repression under capitalism? I mean, there's definitely more. Could you say that there's
Different. Like, so
it's diff-
it would be a question of like how you define repression. So
right?
the under a despot, the despot is the locus of this sort of unvarnished political power. And so you could say that, oh, well, look, there's one guy, he's oppressing all these people. There's so much oppression. But you could also make the case that in the earth socius, the savage, that the way that they immediately write and inscribe into a person of the brutality of the theater of cruelty, you could say that's just brutal too. Or you could say, holy shit, wait, so in capitalism, they actually get families to create the repression within the child and the person themselves, and you repress yourself on behalf of capital. Holy shit. So which ones, it's again, it's not so much saying there's more or less of any of these. It's the shift in how they function and how through that we are produced, because there is no, in this entire ontology or metaphysics, whatever the fuck you want, there's no like true way a person exists. There's not like a true real person over there that's hacked at, like a box, a big block of marble. Oh, the socialist chips away this, or the despot chips away this, liberal democracy and capitalism chips away this. It's like, no. We are formed not from the start, but we are formed by the desiring machines in mass, and how ultimately they also sort of rebound on us through the social production, and so the repression and things that come through there. So we're produced through all of this. So it's not so much saying, well, one is worse than the other. I mean, we could probably say pretty handily that there's some really bad things in all of them, but more, here's how they function, so we can understand how we can fight against them, how we can build something new, and how we can move on. It kind of, or at least start that direction. But it's like that. That's kind of the push that they're making. I think I would proffer. Noah says, I haven't been here for chapter 3. Noah, you're always welcome. I always found it interesting that DNG are able to craft a delineation between despotic socialists and capitalist socialists. I'm not sure why capitalism doesn't just look different in the despotic regime. Well, I mean, that's what we're talking about. The function of how the subject is created, the function of how meaning is made, the function of how production is done is just wholly different. The despot being the end-all be-all source for all sort of alliant formations, filiative formations, the parent of all, with the singular prohibition and the singular power of prohibition, creates a unvarnished power that creates a subject who is sort of, I don't want to say obedient to that power, but built within it. So the despot's able to say, go do these things, go do that, go do these things. And everyone wants that because it's that introduction. Capitalism adds a couple layers to this because it's no longer just about this sort of unvarnished power of overcoding. Oh, you think that's X? I'm the despot. I say it's Y. You keep your silly little things, but you give us all the bricks of the world you make, and I will remake something of it. That is rough in itself. Capitalism doesn't do that. Capitalism decodes and recodes and does it through sort of our own repressed systems. We help the process. We take part, all of us here, all of us take part in the reforming of capitalism and the building of capital. It's not the same thing as how the despotic functions. It doesn't force people to take part or doesn't force people to build the thing that people are unvarnishedly under power. Capitalism is kind of ruthless that way. And they kind of make that sort of early point here. The example of feudalism they use, there's private property, commodity production, monetary afflux, extension of the market, development of towns, appearance of manorial ground rent and money farm. All of this does not produce a capitalist economy, but rather a reinforcing of feudal offices and relations. At times, even a return to even more primitive stages of the system, and occasionally even the reestablishment of a kind of a slavery at the time. It is well known the monopolistic action favoring the guilds and companies promotes not the rise of capitalist production. Capitalist production is a very different beast than this. But instead, it's about the insertion of the bourgeoisie into a town and state feudalism that consists in devising codes for flux that are decoded as such, keeping merchants in the very pores of the old body. Mercantilism is not capitalism. I mean, it's also true for Marx and kind of a lot of other thinkers. It's not just me saying random shit there. So it's not quite that simple, but it's a different kind of beast. That makes sense, Noah?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I've just been like teaching a little like Hobbes lately, so I've been thinking a lot about, monarchies and despots and stuff. I just think like sometimes like these delineations are just kind of difficult for me to grasp, especially like when we're looking at like I'm in the United States, so I'm looking at like some like unchecked power by like presidents, right? Like Trump or something, or like this kind of diving back into a little bit of despotism or something along those lines where now the concentration of wealth means that oligarchs have more power, right? So it's almost like there
Or-
is decoding, of
Or
course, capitalist socius, but it's like it seems like, you know, the line is almost blurred to an extent.
It's by the way, I just dropped the book that you just need to read. I've been crowing about it already today, but State and Politics from Guillaume Sabatine-Blanc that goes over the Urstadt specifically, because this is it's a thing I've had a lot of trouble with too. Is like, well, wait, it's clear we live in an oligarchy, or Russia is an oligarchy, or we have these strong men, but the strong men of today, even in places like, I would even argue like North Korea, don't operate the same as the strongmen of old or the despots of old. Having a singular strongman isn't really the marker of despotism, not in the way that they're using it, because despotism is, again, in their use, the socius. It is the social machine through which our production happens, our repression happens, and the sort of larger social structures exist. The state existing between two of them is really going to be what is causing, in my mind, at least for me it was, is causing a lot of that confusion, where it's like, well, look, the state, here's how the state operates, here's how the state operates now. So you feel like you can go back and forth, but the nature of today, and this is true of even for fucking North Korea, is the market actually controls all of these things. And there is no way to just be the singular despot. That position is gone. Instead, capital is the winner of that contest, to say the least. So the oligarchs come and go per capital's needs. The classes come and go per capital's needs. Capital and the marketplace are the ones who are really the ones doing this. And so it's a very different beast than having a single person in charge, or having the despotic regime of an oligarchy or a guild or whatever it may be through various state interventions. Even though that may be the case now, their delineation between them is significantly important. So it's a different direction with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. That clears it up.
So by comparison, with between capitalism and despotism, in terms of schizophrenia, right? Would there be, is he saying that there are not such, notions of schizophrenia or conditions of schizophrenia in a despotic or in the those other, feudalistic systems, and that you find schizophrenia in capitalism? Would that be the distinction of capitalism, that that's where you find schizophrenia?
You find things kind of everywhere. So they're trying their best, and I don't think they do it very much. They don't want to sort of come back and go, oh, well, here's this is the setup. Instead, as the time has gone on, as we enter a new society, as we move from the earth to the despotic to now the capitalist system reveals, through the way repression works, other things that are existent within us that we can then use to sort of look back. And that's what this universal history has been in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is dedicated to this idea of, well, look, we understand these pieces. We're able to see them because of this sort of odd vantage point we're at now. So let's go back and look through the formation of them, because we haven't really got a body without organs functioning, not in the way that we are talking about it, but we're able to see pieces of it appearing, things of these processes appearing. And by doing that and making it sort of that universal history, we're able to see sort of a genealogy of repression and how historical social repression comes to bear on us today. That's kind of the push. So when we talk about they will say there's schizophrenia being sort of the illness of capitalism, and they make comments like that a lot, and a lot of people really take it far. It's less that they're saying that schizophrenia didn't exist before capitalism. It's the nature of subjectivity sort of is differing between these socii in significant ways. They talk a great deal about the paranoiac, and there's like historical records of, the kings being this way, subjects being this way. There were probably schizophrenia by what we would call it today. They wouldn't have called it that back then, because the nature of subjectivity and how things were produced and how things were put together didn't exist like it does now. So there's a little bit of from our vantage point, going back and naming things. And this is what the chapter on the Urstadt is really about, is us from our position going back and saying, oh, look, all of these things started showing up here. Therefore, this is where the state started. And we always happen to need those things to exist. But why? Well, because those are the things that make a state. So there's a little bit of a going back thing. Yeah. But so when they say at the end of this paragraph specifically, the capitalists appear in succession in a series that institutes a kind of creativity of history, a strange menagerie, the schizoid time of the new creative break. This is where they're talking about the move from the despotic to the capitalist socius. This is how they're making that move specifically. And so this is the schizoid time, is as these capitalists show up, start doing things and start decoding and then recoding, and we start seeing a new shift in how subjectivity is made, and ultimately the socius underneath all of that.
Yeah, one of private property, the beginning of the initial beginning of private property correlates with the paranoia. Paranoia.
It's part of the despotic state. So yeah, I mean, it's they talked about the king and the despot being this paranoiac because it's one of those wonderful, horrifying things. They're expected to be infallible, but also that means also be infallible, and all goes through them. They're produced just like anything else. It's not like they're in on the joke and God goes, actually, don't worry about it, Steve. You don't really have to know. Like they're produced as much as anything else. So there's a deep paranoiac sort of relation that they have with everybody because of the nature of the alliant and filiative going through them. I do want to get to the next paragraph because it will help us start to break down a few of these things. How do I want to reread any parts of this or go over? No, I think we've kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit about this. The next paragraph, as we make our move and as we go on, is going to be asking how capitalism came to be. Where was it seen? Why didn't it appear in certain places earlier or later? They're going to be making some historical claims. Now, they're interesting, and they are not necessarily out of line with a lot of historical sort of timing of things. So as we make our way through, feel free to disagree, give me sources. We'll battle this because there's a lot in here that I think is really interesting and useful, but also it's a lot. All right, we'll continue. The dissolutions are defined by a simple decoding of flux, and they are always compensated by residual forces or transformations of the state. Death is felt rising from within, and desire itself becomes the death instinct, latency, but it also passes over into these flux that carry the seeds of a new life. Decoded flux, but who will give a name to this new desire? Flux of property that is sold, flux of money that circulates, flux of production and means of production, making ready in the shadows, flux of workers becoming deterritorialized. The encounter of all these flux will be necessary, their conjunction, their reaction on one another, and the contingent nature of this encounter. This conjunction and this reaction which occur in, let me re-say that. And the contingent nature of this encounter, this conjunction, this reaction which occur one time, in order for capitalism to be born, for the old system to die, this time from without, at the same time as the new life begins and desire receives its name. The only universal history is the history of contingency. Let us return to this eminently contingent question that modern historians know how to ask. Why Europe? Why not China? Apropos of ocean navigation, Fernand Braudel asks, why not Chinese, Japanese, or even Muslim ships? Why not Sinbad the sailor? It is not the technique, the technical machine that is lacking. Isn't it rather that desire remains caught in the nets of the despotic state, entirely invested in the despot's machine? Quote, perhaps then the merit of the West, confined as it was on a narrow Cape of Asia, was to have needed the world, to have needed to venture outside its front door. The schizophrenic voyage is the only kind there is. Later, this will be the American meaning of frontiers, something to go beyond, limits to cross, flux to set in motion, non-coded spaces to enter. Damn it. There's just a lot said inside of this one. Jack, you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I think the through line's not too bad. So, I mean, this is basically like the main question is why. Okay, so hopping back to the previous paragraph, right? The action of decoded flows is not enough, however, to cause the new break to traverse and transform the socius. Not enough, that is, to induce the birth of capitalism. Decoded flows strike the despotic state with latency, they submerge the tyrant, but they also cause him to return in unexpected forms. They democratize him, oligarchize him, segmentalize him, monarchize him, and always internalize and spiritualize him, while on the horizon there is the latent erstat, for the loss of which there is no consolation. Okay, so the basic question right now is how does the despot socius deal with decoded flows, right, which it's trying to stave off, and yet how are those decoded flows going to become enough such that we can have the second grade deterritorialization, that capital can overcome the despot as socius. So what I'm getting out of this is basically it seems like they're saying the codification and everything that the earth provides, right? That's being overcoded by the state. It sounds like part of their suggestion, or at least what I'm going to propose as a point of inquiry, part of their suggestion is that by overcoding and introducing that latency, it's possible that that vengeance against the earth is also creating a decodification that it in turn has to stave off, right? Because I figure that's part of how they're getting this deluge, not deleuze, but deluge imagery in the beginning. So if we hit this, so the dissolutions are defined by a simple decoding of flows, and they are always compensated by residual forces or transformations of the state. So, and that's kind of what I'm driving at here, right? There is a dissolution defined by a simple decoding that's always compensated by residual forces or transformations of the state, which basically sounds like overcoding. Death is felt rising from within. So notice the feeling, right? We're kind of thinking of the conjunct now. And desire itself becomes the death instinct, the latency. But it also passes over into these flows that carry the seeds of a new life. So, right, that point about latency, right, which is part and parcel to the Earthstand, the despotic state, right? Notice how it's this is a nice pun they're doing here, but it's actually consistent with like Lacan and that, right? Even though the death instinct is rising up as part of the under despotic conditions, it's carrying with it the potential for a new form of desire, right? For new conditions of desire. Decoded flows, who will give a name to this new desire, right? And that's what we're really interested in. Flows of property, flows of property that is sold, flows of, that's terrible English, flows of money that circulates, flows of production and means of production making ready in the shadows, flows of workers becoming deterritorialized. The encounter of all these flows will be necessary, their conjunction, right? So we're thinking third synthesis here. And their reaction on one another, and the contingent nature of this encounter, this conjunction and this reaction, which, God, this is a long sentence, which occur one time in order for capitalism to be born and for the old system to die, this time from without, at the same time as the new life begins and desire receives its name. So right off the bat, right, like you're seeing how overcoding is giving way to some form of decoding, right? And paradoxically, it's not going to be through the second synthesis that this deterritorialization second great deterritorialization takes place, right? It's going to be through the conjunct. So the breach of the limit, right, as it were, is going to be a question of the third synthesis. I'm going to pause there if anybody has questions or comments.
I'll be coming back to that in a second. I'm going to be looking for this footnote.
Coming back to questions. Okay.
I'm going to look for a footnote, so you go ahead.
Questions later.
Can you hear me?
The only, yep.
Okay,
Can
good.
you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
So the only universal history is the history of contingency, right? That's 3.1. So then the question is why Europe and not any other continent or seemingly country, because China is not Asia, but it is not the technique, the technical machine that is lacking. So it's not that the socius couldn't use what's in, say, China or say like the Islamic empires, for instance, to produce this the second great deterritorialization, right? It's that in those, we'll say, empires, the desire remains caught in the nets of the despotic state, entirely invested in the despot's machine. So that point about the pores in society, right? Uh, that's kind of it, right? There's a clog. It doesn't let the decoded flows out, so to speak. Perhaps then to the merit, this is a quote, West, confined as it was on the narrow Cape of Asia, was to have needed the world, to have needed to venture outside its own front door. So, and this is the last point, right? It's exteriority. And this is very similar, but different, paradoxically, from the first great deterritorialization, right? The primitive socius conditions its own limit, and in doing so, conditions the possibility of overcoming that limit, right? And that possibility is realized through the despot. In the same sense, the despotic socius conditions its own limits and possibility of overcoming, which capital is able to do, right? The difference is the movement outward, say into the world, but more importantly, the movement of the decoded flows kind of into the world, if you follow me, upon the social body, that is. That's something that, for Deleuze and Guattari, right, the Europeans are able to pull off.
Well, that's
Whereas the
important.
other,
So just to go with this real quick, it's important.
whereas the others don't. Go ahead.
It's important. What's being discussed here is Braudel. So Braudel's theory of European hegemony and the nature of things. When you read this paragraph, or you even read that, it sounds as if there's a bit of a Eurocentric viewpoint, and actually Braudel's very, very much the opposite. The way that he went about sort of his writings on history, and if you haven't read Civilization and Capitalism, 15th through 18th century, series of huge books in English, his idea is basically that, actually, until, I don't want to say the 1800s, the world was actually Asian. Like, it was centralized power structures were in Asia. That all the stuff that was happening there was within Asia. That actually the Europeans were significantly sort of second sort of level. They were behind the times economically. They were sort of disempowered, and that as we saw this sort of shift happening, as we made a move from sort of the central powers being inside of Asia, India, China, Middle East, various sort of structures there, the move made it over, because one of the things that, as they're kind of getting at here, as their wording is kind of odd in it, to just say it's not the technique, not the technical machine that is lacking. It's not that they didn't have the tools, which some people have said. It's not that. It's not that they were advanced. It's that there was actually a very sufficiently powerful despotic state, and hegemony was in their control in the East, that actually kept it in its place. The phrase Cape of Asia is what Braudel was calling Europe, Europe as the Cape of Asia, because up until the 1800s, that's effectively what it was. It was an offshoot of that. And so because of that, there was pressure on Europeans to go see the rest of the world, to go do other things, to find more. Whereas within India and China, they were in the seat of power. The seat of power didn't have a need to venture outside their front door. And this kind of push is what gave the Europeans room to go do other things. And as such, from the outside they're referring to, where capitalism appears, is part of this. It's part of that process and that growth in that direction. It's very different. It's not a Eurocentric view on this one at all.
So what do they mean by the what does he mean by the schizophrenic voyage?
Because
Is that
because a voyage, they mean quite literally that if you're going somewhere that no one's ever been, it's a schizophrenizing process.
okay?
There's no voyage except for that.
Okay.
Go to the
It
moon,
sounds
go to
like,
Mars, go to Americas, go explore
Right.
some new place. There's nothing you can do except sort of allow new connections because it's wholly unknown.
Right. Is that like Columbus? Taking his long voyage to the Americas and breaking out of the despotic the net of the despotic state.
Yeah, it's the breaking of the limit and the exceeding the limit.
I see. Yeah,
And
like
again,
American.
doesn't have to be good. This does not mean it's a good thing. It's not, oh, good, because I know there's fucking Deleuzians who said shit like this. The idea that, oh, well, look, Christopher Columbus and the explorers, they were schizophrenizing. Therefore, what they did is good. No, it's not. They're not saying that. They're just saying the nature of the process that produced it.
So that would imply that that the schizophrenic condition was also could be a product of the despotic state, right?
So they're not saying that here. Here they're talking about the voyage itself is naturally schizophrenic because it has no known quantities. You can't be paranoid about the unknown. You can't, if you're crossing over a limit, if you're going beyond these spaces that are hard coded, it's a schizophrenizing journey. It's not, doesn't mean the people are schizophrenic at all. They may not be, but the voyage is that thing. It is a schizophrenic process they're talking about here. And that's, again, they're being very particular in how they're talking about these things. Because when we speak of the despotic and power and the ability to stay within it, the phrase they're using for China, Japan, Middle Eastern, India, there's this really interesting phrase they're talking about. It is, first off, it's not that they're lacking, it's that desire remains caught in the nets of the despotic state, entirely invested in the despot's machine. That's accurate. There was just the totality of the despot. That was the thing. There was no need to go beyond it. But the Cape of Asia, which I think is a great phrasing for Europe prior to 1800s, I'm going to start using that. The Cape of Asia that Europe had none of this centralized power. The UK really hadn't really become its thing yet. There were ships being sent out and all that stuff, but we hadn't gotten to the stage of really hardcore empire for hundreds of years quite. We were on the verge of it. And so there's this really odd thing of they didn't have the power, they didn't have the absolute investment in the despot's position because they weren't really the ones in power. They didn't have a totality of things. They didn't have sort of all, I don't want to say all the needs met, but having desire fully trapped. And I have studied some level of Chinese history, fortunately. But I would ask if anyone's more familiar with Japanese or any of these others, is this an incorrect way to sort of talk about it? From, I would say prior to 1700s, it's a pretty good way. The Europeans basically existed to constantly be infighting, trying to figure out how to gain power and how to trade better. Whereas there's a different type of stability that existed where the despotic state had the investments fully and things were more, I would say, had some stability, I think would be the phrase for it.
Maybe to approach that differently, right? So I mean, it's a point of departure, right? So the despotic comes with a point of departure, right? And that's the story of Abraham. He leaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar, right? He leaves, and it's a similar point here. The decoded flows leave now.
I'd recommend Brodell for anyone who wants to read a very. I'm picking it back up because of that fucking discussion around my absolute misunderstanding around medieval history. So I'm going back and rereading Brodell anyway. So it's good timing for that.
Yeah, so the migration of Europeans to the Americas, right? South America and North America would
And
be
everywhere.
right, would be like a schizophrenic voyage, right? To break free from the despotic,
Uh,
from the
all voyages have to be, and this would be,
right.
all voyages have to be, I think. Um, Again, it's sort of the nature of going somewhere where you're outside the limit, outside of the coded space. Uh, it's sort of that thing. I don't want to go much further than that. I think they're just saying this as the note of like, look, voyages began. Voyages weren't really a thing for any, like, the large Asian powers. Voyages weren't their thing. They'd conquered lands. They were having sort of small political infightings or large scale infightings or large scale wars, but they were very much inside of the same spaces. They weren't out discovering new areas in the same way that, you know, others were. You could even go back, though, the Earth Socius and others, as the Polynesian people found their way to what we call Hawaii now, or even further to other islands. Like, the nature of a voyage of this type is beyond a frontier, a crossing over of a limit, a flux to set in motion, a non-coded space to enter. It is, you bring to it the Earth Socius or the despotic, sure, and it kind of becomes overcoded immediately, as it would within sort of the despotic or other things. But this setup is really fascinating. And yeah, Otterwaffle, that's my understanding too. China looked inward more than outward. People like Sheng He were rarely given state support to go out and look at the world. It was not seen the same way because, again, they had an extraordinary amount of power. If the power seat was in Spain, they would not have been sending people out. Like, there was a lot more, a lot more in terms of land, in terms of industry, in terms of economic forces, in terms of internal fighting and infighting. It was the center of the world until and I do like the phrasing. I like the phrasing a lot of the Cape of Asia. It's a thing I forgot about. I like that.
I mean, it may be, but I wouldn't get too into the word voyage, right? Because it's not like travel didn't exist prior to, Columbus or whatever, right? In fact, he's trying to go to India, right? Like it's the movement of decoded flows as a move to as opposed to the movement of codification into overcodification, right? That's the thing that's going on with the schizophrenization instead of like a paranoiac movement or a kind of schizophrenic movement in the earth, which has its miraculative movement.
It's a line of flight though, right? It's still
In
way
a,
up. Huh?
in a way,
Right,
it is a departure.
right.
Question on the line of flight usually comes in with like how the BWO is concerned, right?
But it is an expression of the molecular, right? Yeah, a way of escaping, from the limits of the molar, right?
The line of flight kind of gets at that, but the great deterritorializations, right? Like we're talking about changing socii. Now, Does that mean the BWO can't be involved? No, the BWO can be involved. But does that mean these deterritorializations are caused by the molecule and the BWO? I would say not necessarily.
The phrasing. All right, one sec.
I guess while you're doing that, like, and notice what's shifting here, right? Like this, I love how they just move across the globe. The American meaning of frontiers, something to go beyond limits, to cross over, flows, to set in motion, non-code spaces to enter. Like you're gonna see this later on in the section when they start talking about how the relative limit is changed and its displacement, right? We're not going to go into that now, but just to tee that up, since they're kind of alluding to it here. Give you a spyglass, as it were.
I'm digging through Braudel right now. Sorry. Always fun because they're sourcing, and the source says the French version, and it's like, God damn it. No idea even how to start looking for the right thing there.
Not sure on Braudel, but yeah, I guess while you're doing that, does anyone have other questions about the paragraph or thoughts on it?
There's non-coded spaces to enter. Wouldn't that be like the body without organs, the expression of desire and production?
No. So non-coded spaces. So again, when we're talking about the codification that exists for, let's just say, people going on journeys. Let's talk about Marco Polo, or you talk about fucking Magellan. I don't like pick your horrifying nightmare. The going into these non-coded spaces means specifically that the spaces aren't overcoded or coded by the despot or social production. You are entering an area that literally has no codified anything. Like it's effectively a void. You as stepping foot there, it's not codified or overcoded by the despot or your subjectivity. You're unaware of any of that. There may be tribes there that may be coded by the earth or things like that, but that's, again, this is not saying that all humanity is able to understand all humanity. It's you're stepping into a space that just doesn't have any code. So it's uncoded. Now immediately it becomes coded and then overcoded. Like it's just the immediacy of it. There's no existing in an uncoded space for any subject. It's not really a thing you do. But it's entering into it. To step into it is the nature of the schizophrenic journey that they're referring to. And again, don't read too much into that. They're just stating the fact of going somewhere unknown that isn't overcoded by the state is a schizophrenizing act. All right, now I'm going to find this source for this thing. Sorry, I just can't help myself at this point. So, chapter 6. Excellent. Close to the end of chapter 6, which is go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe we could come back to that at the end, or
okay, fine. We can do that. All right, I found the section. Good. All right, we'll come back to it later. We'll continue reading for now. How's that sound? Is that acceptable to everyone? Good.
Sure.
Good. Decoded desires and desires for decoding have always existed. History is full of them. But we have just seen that only through their encounter in a place and their conjunction in a place that takes time do decoded flux constitute a desire. A desire that, instead of just dreaming or lacking it, actually produces a desiring machine that is at the same time social and technical. That is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by decoded flux, but by the generalized decoding of flux, the new massive deterritorialization, the conjunction of deterritorialized flux. It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensured the universality of capitalism. By simplifying a lot, we can say that the savage territorial machine operated on the basis of connections of production, that the barbarian despotic machine was based on disjunctions of inscription derived from the immanent unity, immanent being that of the king, immanent power. But the capitalist machine, the civilized machine, will first establish itself on the conjunction. When this occurs, the conjunction no longer merely designates remnants that have escaped coding or consummation consumptions, as in the primitive feasts or even the maximum consumption, in the extravagance of the despot and his agents. When the conjunction moves to the fore in the social machine, it seems, on the contrary, that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of a class, that it makes luxury itself into a means of investment and reduces all the decoded flux to production in a production for production's sake that rediscovers the primitive connections of labor on condition, on the sole condition that they be linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body, the true consumer, from whence they seem to emanate, as in the pact with the devil that Marx describes, the industrial eunuch. So it's your fault if, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Going right back to castration.
I mean, it is, but it's a unique placement for castration. There's so much fucking said in these paragraphs. God damn it. It's always good, by the way, to have read Capital. It's just a thing that would really help in all of this.
Did Marx use that term, industrial eunuch? It sounds very Freudian and at the same.
Yeah, it's
It
the
does sound Freudian.
it does sound Freudian, and it's I mean the underlying thing that it's pointing out is this idea of the place that desire doesn't actually come from, but seems to, the industrial eunuch, the capitalist unable to enact their desire because they are so central to capital, they're so produced by capital, they have no desire themselves. They're effectively castrated. They don't have a production of it the same way. And the way that they phrase it is the industrial eunuch, is how Marx talks about it. Let me see if I can find the specific phrasing for that.
It's economic and philosophical manuscripts.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, while I do that, go for it, Jack.
Sure. So again, right, the real critical mass that they're going through, right, is that decoded flows enter the or kind of move upon the socius now. I want to say they entered like they were never there, but they cross a kind of limit, right? Particularly what you might call the absolute limit here. So decoded desires and desires for decoding have always existed. The history is full of them. So the point being that it's not like decoded flows didn't have a place in the other two socii, but it's a special place compared to where we are. But we have just seen that only through their encounter in a place and their conjunction in a space that takes time do decoded flows constitute a desire. A desire that, instead of just dreaming or lacking it, actually produces a desiring machine but is at the same time social and technical. So notice what's being said there, right? Again, it's as though the socius wouldn't use a decoded flow because it wants to use coded flows, at least thinking of the primitive, right? So to constitute social machines is to use coded flows in the primitive. By extension, right, the despotic socius will do this with overcoded flows in constituting social machines. It's only here that we see decoded flows admitted to the production of social machines directly, right? We're getting the other side of the schizophrenic here. This is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by decoded flows, but by the generalized decoding of flows, the new massive deterritorialization, the conjunction of deterritorialized flows. So capital is just not a question of decoded flows, it's a question of how flows, generally speaking, become decoded, right? So if we're thinking of capital and we're thinking of the primitive and we're thinking of the despotic, right? All that the disjunct and everything has been doing is amassing flows through codification or over codification. Now we're seeing something that interacts with those flows so as to decode them, right? And that's the that's the point, really. That's the critical thing here. And what's really important is that this pertains to the use of the conjunct. It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensured the universality of capitalism. So for capital to become socius, it takes the conjunct, not just a synthesis, but the third synthesis. By simplifying a lot, oh boy.
But I
We
mean, they
can
even
say,
say they're simplifying a lot, so don't feel too bad.
yeah,
So,
well, oh boy, right?
Yeah, so they're
so
saying.
the third,
Sorry, go ahead, JK.
I was just going to ask. So the third synthesis is really on is this the level of the socius, right? The disjunctive and the connective they're still like part of the molecular? Uh,
It's
would
it's
that be
all
correct?
part of the unconscious. So it's all part of the unconscious, and it's a matter of where desire is appropriated socially that we
Uh-huh.
see these being appropriated. This is why they say they're oversimplifying, but immediately so we can say the territorial machine was about the connections of production, the connective synthesis directly. Then the despotic machine was based on a disjunction of inscription, which is derived from that sort of appeal to the dictatorship of meaning, the immanent unity they call. But the conjunction, which is the third synthesis, we're still in the unconscious, this is what capitalism claims for itself. And it's a very unique thing that capitalism claims for itself to produce this. The play that ends up happening is, and I actually think it's best described by the thing they're referring to within Marx. The nature of how we're sort of capital takes that in order to basically control or to have desire produced through there. The conjunction no longer merely designates remnants that have escaped coding, which in the earth or the despotic, they would be these little, because things escape coding all the time. It happens, but they do their best to stop it. But it's not that, or the consumption of the primitive feast, or the maximum consumption of the extravagance of the despot and the agents. This is not what we're talking about here. Instead, it is that the nature of the conjunction is that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or the excess consumption of a class, that it makes luxury itself into investment, reduces all of the flux to production in a production for production's sake. I'm going to read the industrial eunuch section because I think it gets across the point very nicely. I put it in the chat. This is just Marx as a thing. To be very specific, this is very, very, let's see, page 50 of Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, the third manuscript. You can just do a Control F for Industrial Eunuch. It's the section that has it. But to read it, sorry. Subjectively, This appears partly in the fact that the extension of products and needs becomes a contriving and ever-calculating subservience to inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary appetites. Private property does not know how to change crude need into human need. Its idealism is fantasy, caprice, and whim. No eunuch flatters his despot more basely or uses more despicable means to stimulate his dulled capacity for pleasure in order to sneak a favor for himself than does the industrial eunuch, the producer, in order to sneak for himself a few pieces of silver, in order to charm the golden birds out of the pocket of his dearly beloved neighbors in Christ. He puts himself at the service of the other's most depraved fantasies, plays the pimp between him and his need, excites in him morbid appetites, lies in wait for each of his weaknesses, all so that he can then demand the cash for the service of love. Every product is a bait with which to seduce away the other's very being, his money. Every real and possible need is a weakness which will lead the fly to the glue pot. General exploitation of communal human nature, just as every imperfection in man is a bond with heaven, an avenue giving the priest access to his heart. Every need is an opportunity to approach one's neighbor under the guise of an utmost amiability and say to him, "Dear friend, I give you what you need, but you know the condition sine qua non. You know the ink in which you have to sign yourself over to me. In providing for your pleasure, I fleece you." This is the shift that has happened. It is no longer that the despot is making demands and everyone's desire is now the desire of the despot. That would be the case with the disjunctive being where socially desire is appropriated. Now it's on the conjunction where all of it comes together. This is the reason that they have these systems in places. They've talked about it: the connective, the disconnection, and selection and recording, followed by the conjunction, consumption. And here is where capital introduces itself, places itself in a place of subservient, but also absolute and total control. Because as the line from Marx in The Industrial Eunuch, this is the pact with the devil. Dear friend, I give you what you need. You know that you must. You know the ink in which you have to sign yourself over to me, and providing for your pleasure, I fleece you. And this is the nature of the shift that has happened with capital, that there's a move and it's latent. Again, all of these things are latent. This is, again, it involves the state. This is the moves within capital. It's different than just having Jeff Bezos say, do X, Y, and Z. No, we don't. That's not how we work. In fact, very few places in the world is that the fucking case. Instead, our desires are really in line with capital. And capital is playing with the conjunctive consumption. And that place is where we find our subjectivity created and our desire trapped most. This is the production for production's sake they're discussing.
Brooks, you just talked about the three syntheses at the on a historical level, from the territorial to the despotic to capitalism.
Yep.
Does it also, the three syntheses also occur at the individual developmental level?
Well, the three syntheses are always there. It's a matter, these are the sort of setup for things. Again, it's the goal of the universal history is to sort of talk through this. But it's how they happen, where they occur, how they get sort of appropriated, how desire gets slammed into them, trapped into them, where it gets trapped, how socially desire is produced through these machines. This is where we start talking about the social machines and the great social machine at top, which is the socius, how it operates and how it works. And it's, again, getting away from overly simplistic definitions that are a lot more after images. Oh, look, we have a marketplace. That must mean capitalism. It's like, no, because just a marketplace may be the king's goods that are all being sold for what the king said and that everyone needs to buy X, Y, and Z. That's not the same as a marketplace as what we have. It's not how it works. In fact, marketplace, and you could even apply this across to even the great irony of the name, the marketplace of ideas, which is what they're talking about. The marketplace of all of this, the decoding and recoding in this process of things. And it's what separates capital out. And so when I talk about The conjunction is no longer, as they say here, and again, they're simplifying a lot, but the conjunction is no longer just sort of these extra little bits that escape coding, or these consumption moments as in primitive feasts, or the maximum consumption of the extravagance of despots and his agents, where you build the palace at Versailles, which would be a consumption of a mass amount of production. This is not that. Those are little bits. Now here is different. When the conjunction moves to the front, it's the thing in the social machine. It seems, on the contrary, it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of a class. It makes luxury itself a means of investment and reduces all of the decoded flux to production. Everything is reduced to production. In a production for production's sake, it rediscovers the primitive connections of labor on condition that they be linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body. So it's a reintroduction of parts. Again, this is, as they've been going through, it's why they're not saying here's a system and then it dies and then the new one. It's like, no, there's all these parts and pieces that are sort of hanging out and waiting. Does that make sense, JK? I hope that was at least a decent answer. It's probably not at all, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Going back to your question, both bodies use all three syntheses.
Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of how they're used, I guess, and where desire is trapped within them. Is that a fair way to put it, Jack? Maybe there's a better way to phrase that.
I mean, both bodies are part of the syntheses, right? But yeah, it's. I mean, the relationship shifts with each socius. You're talking about changing the conditions of production per socius, right? And in doing so, changing the relationship with the BWO. So I mean, you're always thinking about how and the molar are shifting in their relationship by two regimes of the same syntheses.
And we'll be getting into all this. This is just the beginning paragraphs. They're laying out what is to be coming, and there's a lot that is to be coming. I want to say we've got a lot. So I'm going to keep reading. And we'll be getting into decoding, recoding, deterritorialization, reterritorialization, the new inscription under capital. All of these things are coming. These are the early shots. So just be aware of that as we make our way through. Just be noting the terminology and how they're talking about it. Underneath it, the big deal is they're wanting us to be thinking about no longer stuck on the disjunctive, the either or, it means this or this. What does it mean? Which is an appeal again to the immanent unity, E-M-I-N, immanent, like that of the king. But now instead, with the conjunctive being taken, these pieces are still in place. There's still these things. But now at the forefront is consumption and conjunction, the coming together of things, how I feel about a thing, what I want. That is very unique to the capitalist socius. Speaking of capital, at the heart of capital, Marx points to the encounter of two principal elements. On one side, the deterritorialized worker who has become free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity. On the other, decoded money that has become capital and is capable of buying it. The fact that these two elements result from the segmentation of the despotic state in feudalism and from the decomposition of the feudal system itself and that of its state still does not give us the extrinsic conjunction of these two flux of producers and flux of money. The encounter might have taken place with the free workers and the money capital existing virtually side by side. One of the elements depends on the transformation of the agrarian structures that constitute the old social body, while the other depends on a completely different series going by way of the merchant and the usurer, as they exist marginally in the pores of this old social body. What is more, Each of these elements brings into play several processes of decoding and deterritorialization having very different origins. For the free worker, the deterritorialization of the soil through privatization, the decoding of the instruments of production through appropriation, the loss of the means of consumption through the dissolution of the family and the corporation, and finally, the decoding of the worker in favor of the work itself or of the machine. For capital, the deterritorialization of wealth through monetary abstraction, the decoding of states through financial capital and public debts, the decoding of the means of production through the formation of industrial capital, and so on. This is a part of the next paragraph, really, but this is just them saying, like, look, all these pieces, like this isn't really it. We're still not at the thing. We're just not quite there. These things may have existed extra. They may have had these aspects of it, but we're not quite at the point where they come together. How did they come together? Where did this happen? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to go right to the next paragraph, unless someone immediately has a question or a note for me. I'm going to go right to the next paragraph.
I would prefer we not breeze over this.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because I think, like, they've said that part of the states here is that it's important to understand that, it's not as though the decoded flows themselves are the real question. It's that the generalized decoding of flows is the real interest that makes this secondary deterritorialization happen, right? And like they're re-emphasizing that here that I think is worth, in a way that I think is worth at least dwelling on for a moment, um, which I guess I'll just do.
Mm-hmm. Please.
So, I mean, the heart of capital arts points to the encounter of two principal elements. On one side, the deterritorialized worker has become free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity. And on the other, decoded money has become capital and is capable of buying it. So we have two flows here, right? We have a flow of deterritorialization, right? Which appears to pertain to a subject. And we have a flow of decodification, or rather a decoded flow, that appears to pertain more directly to just capital in general. Um, and the relationship is there's a saleability and there is a purchasability, right? So being able to purchase labor isn't the conjunct they're interested in. The fact that these two elements result from the segmentation of the despotic state and feudalism, the decomposition of the feudal system itself, still does not give us the yet stringent conjunction. So that's not a movement of the decoded flows outward. This encounter may have taken place. One of the elements depends on a transformation of the agrarian structures that constitute the old social body, while the other depends on a completely different series, going by way of the merchant and the usurer, as they exist marginally in the pores of this old social body. So you're still dealing with the components of the state there. What is more, each of these elements brings into play several processes of decoding and deterritorialization, having very different origins. That's still consistent. For the free worker, the deterritorialization of the soil through privatization, decoding of the instruments of production through appropriation, the loss of the means of consumption through the dissolution of the family and the corporation, and finally the decoding of the worker in favor of the work itself or of the machine. So that's the conditions for deterritorialization. The conditions for decoding: the deterritorialization of wealth through monetary abstraction, the decoding of the flows of production through merchant capital, the decoding of states through financial capital and public debts, decoding of the means of production through the formation of industrial capital. Okay, so then it ends on just explaining that these are kind of the general conditions for which that deterritorialization and for which that decoding are happening, even though we haven't had the conjunct.
Yep,
Okay,
right. I mean,
I'm good.
that's their point, is that we haven't gotten to the point yet of actually finding what makes the extrinsic conjunction of the two flux. We still haven't gotten there, despite what may seem like having the parts and the decoded elements or the deterritorialization there. We even see that they have decoding and deterritorialization, but no, they have different origins. They have different setups. What brings them together? What is the thing that actually allows this sort of unification of these elements?
So
Yeah,
that,
and I
yeah.
really think the thing that's interesting is that this is a part of the argument they've otherwise staved off to this point. So if you notice, right, in 3.7, 3.6, and so forth, they haven't talked about this. Now they're admitting that it was all there, kind of all along. And now they're dealing with it in such a way as to why it doesn't produce capital, which is still consistent with their argument. But the fact that they slide in this point about decoding and deterritorialization, which has otherwise been staved off, that's why I think it's worth dwelling on, right? Not because their point is that it's not enough, but because it's there. Go ahead, JK.
So this is what they mean by this generalized um, decoding, right, of fluxes. But the main ones are the sale of labor capacity and the capitalist capability to buy that labor capacity, right? Those are two main ones that is distinguishes the capital system from the despotic.
None of this distinguishes the capital system from the despotic yet.
No, okay.
Yeah, these are still just pieces that may exist at various ways. These aren't the defining thing. Because again, remember, we're coming back to the conjunction. The conjunction's the thing. Right now, we've just got stuff. Things happening, stuff being decoded, stuff being deterritorialized. We're not quite there yet because there are other examples of, and this stuff existed in the despotic regimes, the deterritorialization of wealth through monetary abstraction. That's not really capital because wealth was turned into coinage decently. It's an abstraction of it, but it's some level of that. The decoding of the flows of production through merchant capital, a little bit more of the pieces there, but again, we haven't gotten to how the conjunct is being sort of utilized here and how it moves to the forefront. And that's going to be the big deal, because how do we reconcile and combine these elements? The deterritorialization of the soil through privatization of it, how does that enter into conjunction with other elements that are deterritorialized? This is the necessity of how capitalism functions, and it's the important question we have to answer. That makes sense?
Yeah, but what distinguishes the capitalism from the despotic is that it is a free market, isn't it? It's a free market. The worker is free and naked, and is able to sell his capital, and the merchants are able to buy and sell with a lot less restrictions from the state, right? Whereas under the despotic, there are all these restrictions that the despot, imposes, and prevents the market from being as free as it is under capital, right?
Yes, but that's not the whole story of capital, because if all capital did was just sort of deterritorialize or decode, that would be one thing. But that's not really all it does. Like, it also reterritorializes and recodes. And this process is super important because the conjunction, the things coming together, these elements that are coming together, it's not just, oh, we have a free market. There's a lot that's behind that. You could probably make an argument, yes, but again, what does free market mean? Is it like, is it free? Well, not really. No, we have the state, we have laws, we have understandings of how things work. We actually have at the core of our subjectivity the forming of a conjunction that really cares a great deal more about inserting itself or having its desires built and then exploited. This system is unique. This conjunction that all these things come together to produce is unique. And so that's why, like, for me, this section is setting up the big question of, like, so then what is it? What is the thing? And there's a reason that it's also not a broken paragraph in the original. That's This is the
Well,
first part of
whether
a large paragraph.
whether or not it's a broken paragraph in the original, like going back to your question, JK, so I would actually disagree. I would say no, right? I would say no to your question because, and this is what's so interesting, right? They're saying people being
Did I
able to
agree?
sell their labor. Yeah, you said yeah. Um,
Oh, fuck. What was the question?
that's basically the question is, does the sale of labor and the purchasability of labor, is that what distinguishes capital from
I
the
thought I said
despotic?
no, no, because the conjunction of these things coming together is what does it.
Uh, okay, then I think I follow you better. But anyways, again, I would say no to the question. But what's interesting about it is that they're making that disagreement, right? Because they're saying yes, there is a presence of deterritorialized labor and decoded money or capital in the despotic. And that becomes conditions, I think, for the conjunct that we're interested in. But it's not in itself what is actually what does the leap like Brooks is getting at, and it is not in itself what distinguishes capital from the despotic socius, right? The sale of labor in that sense isn't the material thing, though it plays a role.
Because decoding's good. Like I didn't say good. Decoding is a freeing of desire from determinate conditions. There's a recoding that happens because it necessarily has to through these processes. It's how capital works. It's things become freed. Oh, look, the worker is freed from determinate conditions of being specifically X, Y, or Z, or having their entirety be the thing of the despot. But now their labor being sort of abstracted is sort of free to be traded. Sure, except maybe not, because now we have these other things that are going on: the privatization of capital, the state coming in, the recoding of these elements, and the setup of how this works throughout society is kind of the big deal. And this is the push that they're making with, and it's again, that's why I think this whole thing as a large paragraph works best. When we talk about the process of decoding throughout society, we have a second moment of recoding where everything's reterritorialized. We have this other part of it. It's not just that capital does these things. It does, but it also does this other shit as the process continues. The conjunction of these elements that produces a new, kind of a new territory, a new space that suddenly sort of stifles and yokes production under this sort of privatization of surplus appropriation. Well, I'm jumping ahead because that's the next paragraph. So that probably didn't help, probably confused the issue. Let me read the next paragraph and we'll get moving. Let us consider more in detail how the elements come together with the conjunction of all the processes. It is no longer the age of cruelty or the age of terror, but the age of cynicism, accompanied by a strange piety. The two taken together constitute humanism. Cynicism is the physical immanence of the social field, piety, the maintenance of a spiritualized Erstat. Cynicism is capital as a means of extorting surplus labor. Piety is this same capital as God capital, whence all the forces of labor seem to emanate. This age of cynicism is that of the accumulation of capital, an age that implies a period of time precisely for the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flux. As Maurice Daub has shown, an accumulation of property title deeds in land, for example, will be necessary in a first period of time, in a favorable conjuncture, at a time when this property costs little, the disintegration of this old feudal system. A second period is required when the property is sold during a rise in prices and under conditions that make industrial investment especially advantageous. The price revolution, an abundant reserve supply of labor, the formation of the proletariat. an easy access to sources of raw materials, favorable conditions for the production of tools and machinery. All sorts of contingent factors favor these conjunctions. So many encounters for the formation of the thing, it's unnameable. But the effect of the conjunction is indeed capital's tighter and tighter control over production. Capitalism, or its break, the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flux, cannot be defined by commercial capital or by financial capital, these being merely flux among other flux and elements among other elements, but rather by industrial capital. Doubtless the merchant was very early an active factor in production, either by turning into an industrialist himself in occupations based on commerce, or by making artisans into his own intermediaries or employees. This was the struggle against the guild and monopolies. But capitalism doesn't begin, the capitalist machine is not assembled until capital directly appropriates production, and until financial capital and merchant capital are no longer anything but specific functions corresponding to a division of labor in the capitalist mode of production in general. One then re-encounters the production of productions, the production of recordings, and the production of consumptions. But precisely in this conjunction of decoded flux that makes of capital the new social full body, whereas commercial and financial capitalism in its primitive forms merely installed itself in the pores of the old socius without changing the old mode of production. That's the basic. The underlying mode of production is the question here. And this is the mode of production is capital appropriating labor. But it's not just capital appropriating labor. It's not just your labor. It's the way the process happens. All of the flux becoming decoded and then becoming recoded. All of these things coming together to allow that appropriation. These things may have happened throughout centuries. People may have done various parts of this, but we are not actually within capitalism until capital directly appropriates production. Directly. This is the consumption consummation third step. This is the conjunction. This is why this is in the forefront now. This is why capital cares so much about it. Well, I think that's just a weird paragraph to break up, honestly. Is this making sense at all to people? Hello? Anyone? Jack?
Oh, well,
What you got for me?
I mean, yeah, I'm cool. Like, so I mean, notice what's happening to Voluptus here. It is no longer the age of cruelty or the age of terror, but the age of cynicism, accompanied by a strange piety. So note the kind of religious sentiment, right? In this sense, right, like we're talking about Voluptus not as cruelty, not as terror, but as a cynicism. And when that cynicism is accompanied by the piety, right? This is an interesting aside, but since they make it, you get humanism, right? Which the qualification of that is way more interesting than the use of the term. Cynicism is the physical immanence of the social field. So, right, like we might say it's the immanence of like the objects, the concrete particularly. And piety is the maintenance of a spiritualized stat, right? And we can think here about like, the transcendent use of the second synthesis, right? So that point about earlier about, rediscovering the connections of the earth, right? You see that kind of brought into connection, no longer in the kind of retribution of the despite socius, but in a kind of humanism with it, oddly enough. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Period of
sorry,
time.
you're breaking up.
Good.
The important part of these two sides that are being introduced, cynicism and piety, I think they're doing this in order to sort of help us grasp these moments, because cynicism as a thing is sort of this rejection of the I don't want to say the status quo of the materiality of things. There's like a lot of ways to sort of say some weird stuff around cynicism, but it's the shattering of the code. It's the practices that are fixed. This, Marx talked about this. The thing that he sort of admired about capitalism and how it worked is it would look at old codes and it would do so cynically. It would understand, well, what is actually being produced, what's actually being done here, how are these abstractions coming out, and it would allow the decoding to happen. It would allow these codes to sort of be broken about. And this is using cynicism, not I think in its colloquial sense today, but in its more philosophical traditionalist sense, the Diogenes and things like that, the cynics of sort of Greece. This effect is ultimately emancipatory because, I mean, ultimately we don't want to be tied by these codes that are sort of appropriating desire immediately. The challenge becomes we have this other moment of piety, and the piety, the religious aspect, they're speaking of it here in very much the Nietzschean sense, I think. That sort of recodification, they're going to come to call it the axiomatization, but where we take these freed desires and we ensure they're trapped through this other idea of a thing, this fictitious code that isn't really there, in order to privately appropriate and trap desire within the conjunction, to appropriate it for itself. This setup isn't really about the outright owners of capital and the dispossessed. To quote Holland, as from the tension generally socialized production of surplus value on the one hand and its private ownership on the other. On the one hand, capitalism devotes itself to production as an end in itself, to developing the productivity of socialized labor to the utmost. This is the moment of deterritorialization. But on the other hand, due to private instruments in the means of production, social labor and life are restricted to production and consumption that valorize only the already existing capital stock. This is reterritorialization. This is the piety. This is the understanding. This is the capital stock. You must be in service of this. This is the thing we're coming back to. So on the one hand, it's emancipatory. On the other hand, it recaptures. And this is the process of these things as they go. Marx outlines this play very much throughout the third volume of Capital. It's this sort of really odd move. In the first moment, a wave of new, more productive capital stock transforms the existing apparatuses of production and consumption. This continual revolution of the means of production that for Marx characterizes capitalism deterritorializes existing labor and capital to devote them to new forms of production and consumption. This process spawns decoding throughout society, but a second movement happens, a second moment. This progressive movement is abruptly stopped, everything reterritorialized. The evolving apparatuses of production and consumption alike are tied down to what is now obsolete capital stock, solely in order to valorize it and realize profit on previous investments. A wave of deterritorialization liberates all of the creative energies. At the same time, it revolutionizes and socializes productive forces. But then reterritorialization supervenes, yoking relations of production and consumption to the dead weight of private surplus appropriation, the latency of the state. This is the latency
That's
spoken of.
Holland?
That's Holland.
Was that Holland?
Yes. Holland and Marx. I mean, there's quotes from Marx in
Yeah.
there.
So he's saying that
Holland.
is he saying that
Go ahead, JK.
is he saying that desiring production becomes a mode of capitalist mode of production, and that he defines as the industrial capital, and all the other kinds of capital, financial, merchant, commercial, are just conjunctions, subordinate conjunctions of industrial capital, and it does kind of represent the kind of Nietzsche's aesthetic ideal, right? So the capital becomes kind of like a religion,
Mhm.
and it is something that is denies life itself, and it becomes something that we we use we believe in to deny the life deny the life of desire and production.
Yes, it's I would say it slightly differently that what's happening is The connective syntheses are able, like, there's the connections that are happening. There's new production, but we have this really awful thing at the same time. We have the new thing being done. It's ultimately in service of old investments that sort of we are born into. It's the latency of the system is constantly sort of laying into us, and this is where the state comes in. This is as they said, the state is this latency. So it's a really odd sort of, hey, there's all these new production ideas. Great. How do we fit them into the system that already exists? And we've already spent all this money and we've already got all these investments. We've got billions of dollars. Great. You have a really cool idea. Now make it work inside of this system. Don't try to break it. Stay inside. And this double edge that happens is the thing that they're discussing in this paragraph. The encounters of the formation for the thing is enabled. The effect of the conjunction is indeed capital's tighter and tighter control over production. Capitalism, capitalism or its break, the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flux cannot be defined by commercial or financial capital. These are merely flux among other flux and elements among elements. These aren't things, but they're rather industrial capital. In industrial capital, he means capital in the sense of what Marx was talking about here. The merchant may have been very early an active factor in production, turning into an industrialist himself in occupations based on commerce, or making artisans into his own intermediaries employees. But capitalism is different. Capitalism doesn't begin, machine not assembled, until capital directly appropriates production, and until financial capital and merchant capital are no longer anything but functions corresponding to a division of labor in the capitalist mode of production in general. Then you have this re-encountering of the production of productions, the production of recordings, production of consumptions. But precisely in this conjunction of decoded flux that makes of capital the new social full body, whereas commercial and financial capital in its primitive forms merely installed itself in the old socius without changing the mode of production. You'd have commercial and financial capital old in despotic formations, that's fine, but it's not yet capitalism until capital has appropriated production for itself. That's the difference. It's the appropriation for itself that changes it. And it's the switch, the Dobbs quote that they use, Maurice Dobb. An accumulation of property title deeds will be necessary in the first period of time in a favorable conjuncture at a time when this property costs little. The disintegration of feudal system, when it's starting, no one gives a fuck. Sure, like land, what the fuck is this land worth? I don't know. Fucking stuff. Give me whatever. But the second period is required when the property is sold during a rise in prices under conditions that make industrial investment especially advantageous. Oh, excellent. People will give me money for this, and that is to build these things that are needed here because of the latency of the entire thing sort of falling back on the production, and capital itself takes credit for it, appropriates all of these things for it. This price revolution that they're referring to. These are the contingent factors that favor these conjunctions. This is the movement to capitalism. I know you were wanting to jump in here, Jack.
I'm not sure where to.
Well, it's the line. Cynicism is capital as the means of extorting surplus labor. Piety is the same capital as God capital, whence all the forces of labor seem to emanate. The constitution of humanism and the use of these two, very specifically cynicism and piety, as the two parts of this process.
Yeah, it's like bringing together cruelty and terror, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're basically, at least how I read it, right? Like you're basically putting what's there in the earth, right? A kind of what appears to be a non-paralogized use of social production in conjunction. Well, I guess that is the proper way to say that, rather than a slip. In conjunction with the five paralogisms, right? So I mean, the cynicism is that it's using production in a kind of proper sense and using it in a kind of improper sense.
kind of want to do the next paragraph and we'll end there for the day because it's making the last bit of the move, and then next week we'll move into the idea of the full body of the capital and the new socius, because I think this is the last bit that talks about how we've made the move into capital versus just mercantilism.
What does he mean by the two taken together constitute humanism? Humanism is that a form? Is that a philosophy of life? Manipulating nature to serve human human needs.
Yeah, it's I mean, so cynicism is that. So cynicism is very much about sort of directly addressing what is needed and doing away with sort of the commonly understood way things are, the rejection of the sort of common sense of things. But then a piety is also with that, and that's the play he's making and talking about is like, on the one hand, we have the cynicism, which goes, well, hey, wait, what's really happening here? And on the other side, we go, and this is why it's really happening, where we've got kind of the double action happening at the same time. That's what I was reading from the quote from Holland that I really, really like as well, where he kind of dives in and talks about the two, where he's referring to the cynicism as the separation of practices from fixed codes, and then ultimately the recoding of it, tying this freed energy back to factitious codes, which is piety. And it's, again, Nietzsche and his ascetic ideal, this hatred of for Nietzsche, the hatred of religion in that sense, they're very much using here too. Because it's, again, our goal is to sort of find a way back to that piety, I shouldn't go too far outside of the paragraph. I'm going to keep going, but it's those two that they're playing with specifically. The next paragraph, I think, gets into that, and then we'll be talking a lot more, don't worry, about all of these things, because all of this shit is like the next 70 fucking pages.
And maybe to go back to this, because we only have 5 minutes, man.
Yeah, that's fair.
Maybe to go back to your question, it says black humor, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? So, like, to what Brooks said, like, part of cynicism is, it's the David Foster Wallace quote. I can't remember who he got this from, right? But someone once said of irony, it's a bird who's come to love its cage, right? It's a similar sentiment here in that production is using itself and misusing itself. And so that kind of contradiction isn't resolved in any way. It is simply uh, what it is, right? So, like, the cynicism that's getting tied to humanism is that, sure, we have the noble worker and in his free nudity apparently here, right? But it's a free worker in terms of their prostitution, right? And that's got a kind of humor to it. It's got a kind of humanist edge to it in that, it's liberated mankind, right? But it's liberated mankind qua money, right? And that's the underlying punchline of the joke, right? It's people qua money. There's a lot of other things qua money.
It is. I'm actually going to just take us through the next paragraph, because I know we only have 5 minutes. We'll just end up going 5 minutes over, because it is there. The next paragraph is talking about the double movement, and it's a very, very concrete example of what they're talking about. So I'm just going to do that real quick, and then we'll come back to questions. Even before the capitalist production machine is assembled, commodities and money affect a decoding of flux through abstraction, but this does not occur in the same way for both instances. First, simple exchange inscribes commercial products as particular quanta of a unit of abstract labor. It is abstract labor, posited in the exchange relation, that forms the disjunctive synthesis of the apparent movement of commodities, since the abstract labor is divided into qualified pieces of labor to which a given determinate quantum corresponds. They're laying out a very, very specific sort of math of this. Very clear. But it is only when a general equivalent appears as money that one enters into the reign of the quantitas, which can have all sorts of particular values or be worth all sorts of quanta. This abstract quantity, nonetheless, must have some particular values so that it still appears only as a relation of magnitude between quanta. In this sense, it is in this sense that the exchange relation formally unites partial objects that are produced and even inscribed independently of it. The commercial and monetary inscription remains overcoded and even repressed by the previous characteristics and modes of inscriptions of a socius considered in its specific mode of production, which knows nothing of and does not recognize abstract labor. Speaking of the despot, as Marx says, the latter is indeed the simplest and most ancient relation in productive society activity, but it does not appear as such and only becomes a true practical relation in the modern capitalist machine. That is why, before, the monetary and commercial inscription does not have a body of its own at its disposal, and why it is inserted into the interstices of the pre-existing social body. The merchant is continually speculating with the maintained territorialities so as to buy where prices are low and sell where prices are high. Before the capitalist machine, merchant or financial capital is merely in a relationship of alliance with non-capitalist production. It enters into the new alliance that characterizes pre-capitalist states, whence the alliance of the merchant and the banking bourgeoisie with feudalism. In brief, the capitalist machine begins when capital ceases to be a capital of alliance to become a filiative capital. Capital becomes filiative when money begets money, or value surplus value. Quote, value in process, money in process. And as such, capital, value, suddenly presents itself as an independent substance, endowed with a motion of its own, in which money and commodities are mere forms which it assumes and casts off in turn. Nay, more, instead of simply representing the relations of commodities, it enters now, so to say, in relations with itself. It differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value. As the father of father differentiates himself qua the son, yet both are one and of one age, for only by the surplus value of $10 does the $100 originally advanced become capital. This is the move that they're talking about. This is, I think, the center of this. We will get into the next paragraphs next week because it starts getting more complex, but this paragraph to me outlines very concretely this process and how these things come about. That when we have products that are being bought and sold in different places, East India Company buying here, selling here, because they've got it there, a billion things there. Look at all the spices. Let's transport them here. That's not it. That's not the thing, because it's alliant. Capital is alliant. It is alongside labor. It enters into deals with labor, but capital's not making capital, not yet. The shift becomes where we have the surplus value suddenly there, and the surplus value is produced by the $100. The $100 originally advanced because of the surplus now becomes capital and is seen as capital because of the conjunction that's happening across all of this. I think it's an important paragraph. Jack.
I didn't say it was an important paragraph. I said we only have 5 minutes.
I know. Now we only have 5 minutes.
Well, no, I mean, now we're over time, right? But, because, I mean, a lot's being said here. It's going to take more than 5 minutes to really go through it.
Well, I think, so let's do two forms. One is to use this paragraph right now to talk about the discussion we were just having. And then next week, we will reread this paragraph and break it down to continue forward as we move to the place of capital being full body. So let's do 5 minutes and just sort of try to button up a few of the points we were making, if that makes sense.
I mean, what needed buttoning?
We were talking about the way that, well, now I don't know now that I've read it. That's fair. Fair point. You win.
I'm not one for winning.
There's a lot that's been happening here. They're talking about a lot of stuff, the filiative nature of capital versus the alliant. They're talking about, and they're going to be talking about the differentials that are coming into this and how these things interplay with each other. A bunch of shit. I would say at this point, they're putting all of these things in place. The underlying thing that they're talking about is what's said at the very end here, that surplus value and value are generated in a unique way through this conjunction. All of these things coming together, all of these abstract things coming together that are separated with particular values, sure, but they're not placed subordinate to anything else. They are now the thing. Capital has become filiative. It's not alliant. It's not, I give you $20 and we have as a dowry. It's not, we exchange tax value and our nations get along, or I buy ships from you. This is not capitalism. This is just markets. This is just the purchase. Even marketplaces or a free market, quote unquote, isn't really the point, because all of those things are just the alliant use of money. It's the exchange of money. That's exchanging money is the thing that's been around for forever. As Marx said, it's the simplest and most ancient relation of productive activity. But the actual thing that it is, in order to become a little bit more, it needs something else. And it is suddenly this place of capital. To just at the end there, where he's quoting very much Marx, it differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value. The father differentiates himself qua the son, even though you're of one and one age. For only by the surplus value of $10 does the $100 originally advanced become capital, because it produced itself filiatively. So when we talk about the filiative side of things, as we were talking about before, if we go back to the Earth Socius, the filiative and alliant, our tribe makes friends with other tribes. We do trading. We work together. They've got great, it's alliant lines. And we all have different ways that we deal with each other in the alliant, the exchange, external, extrinsic way. But then there's ways we deal with particularly ourselves, but others in a filiative way, in a generative way, in a intrinsic way. And that is making more people, the production for itself. It's not finding more people and dealing with them. It's production of more. Capital being used in an alliant way, great. Capital being used in filiative way, where capital makes money, which it does, by the way. Which it does, money makes money, and it's insane that way, but it does. Capital works that way. So now we've got something. Now it has become capital because it has created its own surplus value. So now it's the alliant and the filiative, all of the meaning that we exist as with people, how we place ourselves or give ourselves coordinates in society, how our debt is assigned to us. Remember, the Earth Socius, it was through the alliant and the filiative grid of things. Some things we owe more people, debt moving around. But then the despot took all the alliant and all of the filiative. He was the father of all, mother of all, brother of all, trader of all, partner to all. All went through him. Having those things continue, it's like, oh yeah, cool, I'm using the despot's face to trade with you to buy things. That's just trading. This is not it. Now capital finally has itself the full body. Once again, well, the alliant and the filiative not being made through the earth, not being made through the despot. Now capital itself is both.
Does the filiative, the word filiative, connote have can be defined as something within the family, or?
Yes. It probably shouldn't be essentialized to that, but it's the filiation that we have is literally making more people. And the use of the father differentiating himself qua the son. I came before, like a latent style, even though really we're one and the same time. My son and I, we exist right now. I differentiate myself as I am his dad. I made him, or my wife made him. That setup, it's a weird one because we're of the same time, but I'm talking about the things that came before and the sort of generative nature of I made him, he was made, and now he will make someone else. It'll be my grandson. This is the filiative line. It's how I differentiate myself as surplus value. And also it's how capital does the same thing, because in line, capital was made, like extra value, surplus value was produced. That $100 of capital that was put in that made that $10 now takes credit for, now is filiative too. I didn't make my son. Like, it's not really how it worked. I didn't like, you know, buy the parts at the store and like like craft him. Like, my wife grew him, and like that, not like a garden, like more like, God damn it, just going. But now I claim him. I made him. He's mine. Now capital gets to do the same thing. They get to claim that $100. That $100 gets to claim itself as capital because of the $10. If I buy a car for $1,000 and I just keep the car, like that's it. It's not, capital has not been used. If I resell that car the next day for $2,000, now I get to say that $1,000 was capital because that $1,000 produced another $1,000. And look, I got $2,000 now. This is the process.
So at the beginning of this paragraph, there's talking about abstract labor
Mhm.
correlates with the quanta by way of this disjunctive synthesis.
Mhm.
That abstract quantity becomes, well, that's what labor becomes, right? An abstract quantity.
Labor can be thought of as an abstract quantity kind of at any point. The change here is we have this general equivalent that appears as money once one enters into the reign of quantitas, the quantification of things, that there is a common value. Now this move is where, when you're talking about the free market, this is what you're talking about, is there's this free market. Well, that's what determines the value of things in capital, that setup and that thing. And so, well, there's always been parts of this. The idea that capital makes capital is the thing that is unique to capitalism. It is the thing only becomes capital after the fact. Otherwise, it's exchange. It's kind of this amazing magic that way.
Right.
And yes, Laloon has a great passage from Marx that I think we've even read before. Everything which the political economist takes from you in life and in humanity, he replaces for you in money and wealth. All the things which you cannot do, your money can do. It can eat and drink, go to the dance hall and the theater. It can travel, appropriate art, learning, and treasures of the past, political power. All this it can appropriate for you. It can buy all this. It is true power. It is true endowment. Yet being all this, it wants to do nothing but create itself, buy itself, for everything else is, after all, its servant. And when I have the master, I have the servant, and do not need his servant. So good. So good, Marx. Good Marx. Good Marx. But now we're 10 minutes over. We'll do a recap of this later this week. And then next week, we will continue from doing the same paragraph again, and we'll revisit and really break down, because there's an extraordinary amount said, especially as we move forward, because the nature of the differential, the nature of flux is going to be central to this as well. So when we talk about the quantitas, the quanta of things, and how the particular value is determined, these things become a lot more bedrock to the things that they're talking about as we go on. So that would be best bet there. So we'll see you guys next week. Otherwise, be watching for the midweek stuff.